What if I told you a single battle brought the world's greatest empire to its knees? Today, on The Explainer, we're diving into the Varian disaster. This was a brilliantly planned ambush in the dark forests of Germania that didn't just wipe out 3 Roman legions, it completely shattered an empire's confidence and literally redrew the map of Europe forever. Let's start with the aftermath, with the raw, heartbroken cry of the most powerful man on the planet. "Quintilius Varus, give me back my legions!" That's what Emperor Augustus reportedly screamed while banging his head against his palace walls. And that tells you everything you need to know about the scale of this catastrophe. This wasn't just a battle lost. It was a deep psychological wound to the Roman soul. So let's set the scene. It's 9 AD, and Rome is at the absolute peak of its power. Under Augustus, the empire has been an unstoppable force of expansion. So naturally, the lands east of the Rhine River, what they called Germania, were seen as the next piece of the puzzle. Roman armies had already been fighting there for years, so turning it into another tax-paying Roman province, well, it seemed inevitable. So how did Rome, this military superpower, find itself on the verge of swallowing up this huge new territory? Let's take a look at the lead-up to this whole disaster. You see, for more than a decade, Rome had been systematically working on Germania. You had generals like Drusus and Tiberius, Augustus's own stepsons, leading one successful campaign after another. They were building forts, bringing tribes to heel, and pushing Roman power all the way to the Elbe River. By 780, the whole area felt so secure that they sent in an administrator, Publius Quinctilius Varus. And that was a huge signal. It meant Rome thought the fighting was over. It was time to start governing and, of course, collecting taxes. Okay, so this whole thing, this entire disaster, really comes down to the relationship between 2 men, one a Roman, one a German. And their stories are just this incredible tale of trust, betrayal, and ultimately a catastrophic mistake. On one side, you've got Varus. He's a career politician, a Roman aristocrat sent to turn Germania into a well-oiled, profitable machine. He was known for being tough, but at his core, he was a bureaucrat, not a battle-tested general. And on the other side, you've got Arminius, a man with a foot in both worlds, a German prince who was actually raised in Rome, given citizenship, even made a knight. He was in the perfect position to exploit Rome's one great weakness, its arrogance. To the Romans, Arminius was the perfect example of their whole civilizing mission. This was the classic Roman playbook, right? You co-opt the local elites, give them a piece of the pie, and then use them to help you roll their own people. Varus trusted him completely. They'd have dinner together, Varus would ask his advice on military matters, all while having no idea that his so-called trusted advisor was secretly uniting all these warring German tribes against him. So the big question is, how on earth did Arminius pull this off? How did he talk a seasoned Roman governor into marching 3 of Rome's best legions? We're talking nearly 20,000 people when you count everyone, straight into a death trap. Well, it was a masterclass in deception. Arminius's plan was just a masterpiece of psychological warfare, really. You can break it down into 4 simple, brutal steps. First, he makes up a story about a small local uprising that needs Varus's personal touch. Second, he suggests a shortcut through a dense forest off the main Roman roads. Third, he promises that his own loyal German troops will meet them along the way to help out. And finally, he makes an excuse to ride ahead of the Roman column, supposedly to gather his forces, but really it was to spring the trap. It was just the perfect con, preying on Roman confidence and Varus's absolute trust in him. And here's the craziest part. This wasn't some perfectly kept secret. Varus was actually warned. Another German noble, a guy named Segestus, who just so happened to be Arminius's father-in-law, told him flat out that it was a trap. But Varus, totally blinded by his trust in Arminius, just dismissed it. He probably thought it was just some petty family drama. And that one decision, man, that was it. The fate of his entire army was sealed right there. All right, so the trap is set. Let's get into the battle itself and see how this perfect plan unfolded into a 3-day nightmare that Rome would never, ever forget. Just try to picture this scene. It's late in the year, September of 9 AD. You have 3 full Roman legions, plus all their support troops and cavalry, snaking through this dense, dark, unfamiliar forest. And of course, it's pouring rain, a torrential downpour that's turned the narrow paths into a muddy swamp. The entire column is stretched out for maybe 15 kilometers. That's nearly 10 miles long. Their greatest strength, their disciplined formations, are totally useless. They're not an army anymore. They're just a long, vulnerable line of men. See, Arminius's forces didn't try to fight the legions in an open field. That would have been a death sentence. Instead, they used the forest itself as a weapon. They actually built earthen walls along the path to funnel the Romans into killing zones. They used hit-and-run guerrilla tactics, attacking from the trees and then just melting back into the woods. For 3 straight days, this was psychological warfare at its most terrifying, chipping away at Roman morale until there was no army left, just thousands of terrified men trying to survive. Think about that number for a second. 17,000. That's roughly how many people, soldiers, support staff, even their families, marched into that forest. This was a huge chunk of Rome's entire military force on the northern frontier. 3. That's the number of elite Roman legions that formed the core of that army, the 17th, the 18th, and the 19th. And these weren't rookies. We're talking about veteran units, the absolute backbone of Roman power in the region. And the number that made it out? 0. Nothing. The defeat was total. The entire army was just gone, wiped from existence, and their sacred eagle standards, the very soul of each legion, were captured. For Rome, you just can't imagine a greater humiliation. So you've got total chaos, the command structure is gone, there's no escape, and the battle is hopelessly lost. So Varus himself, unwilling to face the disgrace of being captured, did what many defeated Roman commanders did. He took his own life, falling on his sword. When the news of this finally got back to Rome, it sent shockwaves through the entire empire. This wasn't just a loss on some distant frontier. This was a psychological blow that would change Roman policy forever. The reaction in Rome was pretty much what you'd expect: shock, grief, and an overwhelming desire for revenge. And you can tell how deep the trauma was because the numbers of those lost legions, 17, 18, and 19, were basically considered cursed. They were never used again for another legion. And while Rome did send armies back into Germania on brutal revenge campaigns, the big dream of conquest was dead. Rome's whole mindset shifted. The age of relentless expansion was over. Now it was about defense, and the Rhine River became the permanent, heavily guarded border of the empire. It's incredible, really. The consequences of this one battle just echoed for centuries. Years later, Roman soldiers stumbled upon the battlefield, and it was still covered with the bones of their fallen comrades. It took decades to finally get all 3 of those lost eagle standards back, but the longest shadow was the one it cast over the future of Europe. The battle drew a line between the Latin-speaking Roman world and the Germanic lands, a division you can still see today in language and culture. And then, much, much later, in the 1800s, Arminius was reborn as a national hero, Hermann the German, a powerful symbol for a newly unified Germany. And that really leaves us with this huge what if, doesn't it? If those 3 legions had survived, if Rome had actually conquered Germania, would a huge part of Germany and Northern Europe be speaking a language based on Latin today? Would the entire history of the continent, the fall of Rome, the rise of modern nations, have played out completely differently? It's a wild question that just goes to show how truly pivotal this one ambush in a dark, rainy forest 2,000 years ago really was.